Good afternoon, this is Jim Williams with the Hurricane City Tropical Update for October 31st around 4:30 p.m. Here's a water vapor shot of Hurricane Sandy as it was making landfall on Monday night, and notice the highlighted areas of the dry air that was working its way into the center of Sandy while it was becoming post-tropical. Generally, when you have a purely tropical system, you have rain bands that work their way in around the center. There's convection all the way around the center, and then the right front quadrant absolutely gets devastated by very high winds. But in this case, that did not happen. The winds were spread out over a large distance, and what happened was the storm surge was the big story. In fact, the winds all in this area were probably sustained around 60, 70 miles an hour with some gusts around 80 or 90, which was primarily around Long Island and areas around there. But the big problem for the coastline was obviously the storm surge because of the trajectory of Hurricane Sandy coming in from the west and then going west-northwest and driving all that water that's been building up with this very large system for days and moved in and inundated a lot of these areas. All right, how did the models perform on this system? Let's take a look and go back to the 24th. This is when this was south of Cuba, and East Cuba got hammered by this hurricane. It was about almost a Category 3 at that time, winds up to 115 miles per hour. What happened was the system moved off to the northwest, hit the northwest Bahamas, stayed offshore, and then moved into southern New Jersey. What model predicted that? The European model. The ECMWF European model nailed the track of this system almost dead on. And the second best performer was the GFDL model, which is the green model here, and that pretty much followed suit. And this was several days before landfall. But notice out here that the GFS, the red model, was taking this out to sea, and the GFS has been a very good performing model this year. In fact, it's been my favorite all year. A lot of the models have been following the GFS, as the GFS seems to be leading on a lot of systems this year. But on this particular storm, the European model nailed it, and it took a while for the GFS to turn around and start taking aim at the northeast coastline. In fact, if we go out a couple days later, you can see that the European continued to show a landfall in New Jersey, although being just north of Atlantic City. The HWRF tropical model nailed the exact path after that, but the GFS was still lingering out here, wanted to take it into Cape Cod and circle around out here before going north. So the GFS was a little reluctant to show a landfall, but eventually it fell into line. The models came into good agreement, and the landfall point was for New Jersey. So hats off to the European model, excellent job. Now, I've seen a lot of references to the 1938 hurricane and how this is the worst hurricane that's ever hit the northeastern United States. Well, that's simply not true. First of all, the 1938 Long Island Express had sustained winds around 120 miles per hour, and it built up this large wall of water that started out here in the Atlantic and moved north, and it was like a freight train rolling in there, and everything on the right front quadrant of Hurricane of 1938 was completely wiped out, devastated, leveled to the ground, and 600 to 700 people were killed in all up here in the northeastern United States. Now, you compare that to Sandy, and Sandy did not have nearly as much time over water. It was a very large system, but the reason Sandy caused such a tremendous storm surge in New York City and areas that were lesser impacted by the 1938 hurricane, again, is because of the trajectory as it moved inland. Plus, the 1938 hurricane was about 60 miles to the east of New York City, and in order for a storm surge to really hit New York City hard, it's got to be on the left-hand side of New York City, or the west side. Now, here is Hurricane Donna back in 1960. There's been a lot of references to Donna as well. And Donna, again, was a long-tracking hurricane, but it came from overland, paralleling the United States, and then hit eastern Long Island, and before moving up in the northeast, about 60 miles to the east of New York City as it was moving off to the northeast. So again, those winds were primarily offshore and out of the north in New York City. That's why you didn't see the real bad flooding from Hurricane Donna, even though Donna was another very large hurricane with a very low pressure. The trajectory of the storm made all the difference in the world as to how much surge was going to pile up in New York City, but it was a glancing blow as it was moving away from New York City at the time, so the surge was not that bad. So it's to say it's the worst hurricane ever especially when it comes to 1938, is really not true reporting because it just happened to hit a different place other than New York City. All right, here's the HurTrack program, and let's go ahead and start the animation and see how this system came ashore in southern New Jersey, and you see it slamming in there on Monday night. Now, what's interesting about this map is that the hurricane force wind field was primarily located just south and right near where the center of landfall was, but believe it or not, we really didn't see a whole lot of hurricane force sustained winds, hurricane force winds on land, period, much less sustained winds. We saw some gust up here around 90 miles an hour in eastern Long Island. There's about 75 over here in New York City, and lesser amounts of wind down here right near where the landfall took place. And that's because the winds were spread out. It was extratropical, so the winds were spread out evenly over a very large distance. The big difference for the areas that were near the center was the storm surge, huge amounts of water piling up, and that's because of the direction of the winds, east to west. The wind was piling up, especially in Long Island. It was just got bottled up in here and started working its way up the rivers and flooded a lot of areas, including all the subways, or at least 7 of them up in New York City, that are going to take a long time to come back. But this is the result of a hurricane coming in just west of New York City versus just east of New York City, like 1938 over here and Hurricane Donna like this. That's the difference, is this one came in like this, and that makes all the difference in the world as far as storm surge. And then you see the system continue to move inland and became a tropical winds less than hurricane force when it reached Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the winds came out of the south. But the big story was the surge on Monday night as Hurricane Sandy moved in. All right, let's take a look at the surge maps here. Now, we have the Hurricane City tracking maps zoomed in on the surge projections from FEMA. What they did is they drew the maps up on the final advisory of Hurricane Sandy based on the current movement, direction, and wind of Hurricane Sandy. These were the projected storm surge inundation maps for the areas that were impacted. We're zoomed in on Atlantic City right now, and you can see that there were some areas about 12 to 13 feet. The yellow areas are lesser storm surge, and the purple areas are higher surge. And you can pan this out or zoom it in on whatever city you want to see exactly how high the water could have gotten in certain areas based on elevation. So this is a real handy map to use at Hurricane City. Also wanted to mention that to the left of this map, the current feature is Atlantic City, New Jersey. When you click on that, the page pops open with all the options for the localized information for Atlantic City, New Jersey. Local news, power outage maps, emergency management. This is a power outage map for one of the power companies in New Jersey, and showing the massive amount of power outages along the coast. Now, these people are not going to get power back for a long time because there's standing water and it's very dangerous to flip the electric back on. So until that water recedes, there's not going to be any work on these lines, or they're not going to be restored for quite some time. So if you're in a coastal area, you might want to go to a shelter or somewhere inland with your friend's house or relative where you can stay until the power is restored in these areas. You can always get news and information from Atlantic City as well on this page. Also, above the tracking chart on the front page of Hurricane City, we have the Long Island page, so you can get all the same information from Long Island and surrounding areas. A great tool to use at Hurricane City. All right, finally, I just want to make a note that our thoughts and prayers, everybody I know is thinking about the people up in New York and New Jersey. This is a devastating event. Even if you were not directly affected by Hurricane Sandy, say you were inland and you maybe lost your power for a few hours, your power's back and everything's fine at your house, you didn't sustain any damage, it still works on your psyche. You're still in the area impacted. It always helps to talk to somebody, get it off your chest, kind of relive the moment of Hurricane Sandy. But even the people that were least affected are going to remember this for a long, long time. The people that were heavily affected, such as have heavy damage to their home or flooding, this is going to be something that is going to work on you for a long time, and you're just going to have to try to remember that. This is nature doing what it does. We have issues with sea level rise. That's a whole other story. I'm very concerned about major areas on the coast, but this is what can be expected when you have a surge that's a major hurricane category type surge with a lesser hurricane. Do not pay attention to the fact that even though it was a category 1, it's not a big deal. The water can pile up in these really large systems, and a lot of water can move in and cause a lot of damage. So we're thinking about the people in the Northeast. Donate any money you can or resources to the people up in these areas. They're going to need it for a long time. Also, on a side note, I've talked to a few of my observers, people. Tony Monduro from the Harrison Weather Center. He says he's working hard with the recovery efforts in his area. There's a lot of damage, a lot of power outages. Fred up in Long Island told me that he could not film the live Ustream because he's having trouble connecting because of power issues and cell tower issues and the overloading of the systems up there. So he's not staying at his house. He hasn't been back yet. He doesn't know what kind of damage he's going to experience, but at his house, which is in Belmore, Long Island. But everybody needs to just take their time on this. Let's gather together. Everybody can pick themselves up. This will be a long recovery effort, but just keep it up and things will eventually get back to normal. And that's it for now. Luckily, things are quiet in the tropics. It's near the end of the hurricane season, which ends on November 30th. So there's nothing out in the tropics right now that looks like it's about to crank up, so you can relax from that angle of it. And we'll be back with any other updates. One final note, the Weather in the Media show has been canceled for tomorrow night, 8 p.m. My guest was Chris Kridler from the author of Twist of Fate, and it's a love story that takes place out in the Midwest between storm chasers, and it gives a lot of inside stuff about storm chasers. A really cool book. We're going to have her on to talk about that book, but that'll take place on the 13th of November, the middle of the month, once the hurricane recovery is pretty much, people are over settled into what's going to happen up in the Northeast. The elections will be over with, and everything will be cleared in the air, and we can focus on her book. All right, that's it for now. Thank you again for visiting Hurricane City.